Hello to all my students out there. The first thing I want to say is that this is a bonus recording. It is not a required part of any course, and there is no reason to watch this except for your own interest in doing so. But this week I've just had a collection of poetry published, and I thought I would do a reading for my students. And I intend to read and talk about 8 poems from this volume, which is called Moon's Yard. The first poem I want to read is called Erasmus, and these are the thoughts of a parent when their child leaves and goes away on Erasmus. Erasmus, our daughter's gone, part of that great flock that flies out from the cliff of its childhood to settle in digs, in Hull, in Helsinki, or in Cordoba. The children of the north are moving south, and the children of the south are moving north, scholarshiping a passage across Europe, while we stay put to conduct the commerce of a diminished empire. Not since the wagons of the Vandals trundled across the ice at Mainz has there been so much mobility, nor such a cold winter. So, in general, I don't write autobiographical poetry. This seems to have an autobiographical element in it, and indeed my daughter, she didn't go on Erasmus, but she did go to England to do her degree. I just want to point out a couple of phrases here. Settling in digs. Digs are rented accommodation. In Hull, in Helsinki, or in Cordoba, recalls to mind a proverb about, or an English saying about, from Hell, Hull, and Halifax, may the good Lord preserve us. In Hell, in Helsinki, or in Cordoba. Hull and Halifax were 2 cities in Yorkshire, 2 towns in Yorkshire, which were notorious for the brutality and frequency of their public executions. So there's a kind of echo of that in my choice of European cities here. And secondly, I'm talking about how parents, as empty nesters when their children have left, seem to live in a diminished empire, and that calls up the wagons of the Vandals trundling across the ice at Mainz. Now, one of the moments when the Roman Empire collapsed early in the 5th century was when the Rhine, the River Rhine, froze so solidly that the Vandal barbarians from the Germanic tribes were able to cross the Rhine, and they did it in huge numbers with all their weapons and their wagons with them at Mainz. And this in a way is typical of my work, in that I like to go back to a medieval world, an ancient world, a mythical world, and use that as a setting for my poetic landscapes. There's something similar can be seen in the next poem I'm going to read, called Council of Princes. And here I'm playing with 2 legends, 2 myths, which I'm sure, 2 images, which I'm sure you know well. One is the Cinderella story, and the other is the business of princes and frogs. And this is, if you like, the Cinderella story told from the point of view of the prince. Another thing you'll notice here is really the area, the general air of nastiness that creeps in, and unfortunately I find it's there in a lot of my poems. I don't do nice, sweet birds and bee flowers at all. There's quite a nasty streak in a lot of my writing, and I'm not altogether where that comes from. Anyway, this is the Council of Princes. Council spelt Counsel, meaning advice, rather than Cil, which is a sort of union of princes. Council of Princes. She's the one the slipper fits. So, after you've admired her ankle, kissed her instep, and caressed her calf with the palm of your hand, it's time to remount, to ride back to the castle through thunder and deluge. There's so much still to be done, querying wills and the quelling of rebellion. Good men to be strung up by their thumbs. Brandy ordered for the court torturer. Before all else, a disavowal of the rumour that you are a mere warty amphibian. Influencing public opinion, winning the populace to your cause, getting garrulous goatherds to sing, for he's a jolly good fellow, as they stagger through the bonfire. Why, that's the easy part. The hard task comes when you run your hand over your own skin. So it begins with a touching of skin. First it's the prince running his hand over Cinderella, or the girl's foot and calf, and at the end he runs his hand over his own skin, really seeing if he's a prince or an amphibian, a frog. And I think some of the ideas here, for me at least, are how much damage people do when they commit to relationships, like damage in the way of putting all of their energy into one another and abandoning friends and things like that. And of course, self-doubt. Is the prince really the prince? Is he really worthy of Cinderella's love? I write quite a lot of experimental poetry. So here's one, and really you have to look at it to appreciate it. It was written in the mid-90s, before when text messaging was all the rage, but before we had those smiley little faces, and emoticons were all written with punctuation marks. And so I have on the right hand side punctuation marks. I use them as my emoticons. And there is one which you will hear early in the poem that I need to explain, and that is the word cripes. Cripes being kind of the equivalent of the northern Italian ciumbi. I'm pausing because I cannot find it. I cannot see it. Here it is, page 48. Rolling on the floor with tears in my eyes. I'm not drunk, just hungover after too much beer. Yesterday, cripes, what a fool I was. I met a girl, an angel, with lipstick and shades. It started with a wink, which made her smile. I bought her a rose, and she gave me a hug. I gave her a kiss, then one of these kisses, and finally one of those kisses, as greedy as a vampire. Then things turned sour. She said, "See you later," and left. I'm still crying, rolling on the floor with tears in my eyes. Another feature of my poetry, after the nastiness I've mentioned, that I'd like to kind of bring people's attention to, are my titles, some of which are works of art in themselves. And here's one called "How Much Madder Than the Grand Duke Can the Grand Master Be?" And I like to think of this poem as being a history of patriarchy in 15 lines. How much madder than the Grand Duke can the Grand Master be? The Duke has his bride in tinfoil, crinkling down the aisle, the dazzle of 1,000 candles, dancing off a dress which combines the maximum of constraint with a minimum of covering. One step too brisk, and she will reveal her bruised white limbs, even here in the house of God. The timid snail leaves a glistening trail as it slides towards the gates of heaven. Yet this girl has nothing. The Grand Master looks on, his face oak wise, his anointed beard as sleek as a cat's paw. So you have two men here. You have the Grand Duke, who's clearly a figure of a powerful figure, a ruler, and you have the Grand Master, who's the kind of power behind the throne. You find a Grand Master, there's a Grand Master of chess. It's not usually an official position, but it's a kind of eminence grise figure. And to go back to my note of nastiness, this girl has bruised white limbs. We don't know why, it's not explained. Another poem with a long and interesting title, possibly, again, a title that's more interesting than the poem. This is fun, just a little bit of fun, and a lot of my poetry is comic. As a result, it's never going to be taken very seriously. Entry for the Eurosceptics Tunnel Vision Song Contest. Vienna's shilling has proved willing, like the Italian lira, to disappear, and Denmark has lost its crown. In Belgium, the franc silently sank, while sterling is sticking around. If you've got no pesetas, you can't buy no potatoes for that glorious omelette of Spain. A French offer of francs won't receive any thanks, yet sterling is still in the game. There's not much kudos in carrying a skudos. Germany's mark has gone into the dark, and in Ireland the pound has lost ground. I'd rather they sack me than pay me in drachmae, but sterling's still sticking around. Okay, Um, Now, we've had a couple of poems about relationships. I've mentioned nastiness and I've mentioned titles. This poem is called Listing, and on one level it is a list, but to list has another meaning. It's when a ship is leaning over when it's going to sink. And this list is also, I think, about the sinking of a relationship. Listing. The light of reason, the light of hope, the light of wisdom, the light of understanding, the light of hindsight, the light of maturity, the light of love, the light of Christ, the study light, a steady light, a spiritual light, the light of life, the light of the soul, the only light that you have not put out is the standby light on the TV set. And now we are going to move on to a poem which I think contains a bit of everything. A good title, some playfulness, the landscape that I like to inhabit, which is medieval, mythical. And the title of this poem is A Cinnamon Merchant Describes England to the Satrap of Tashkent. Theirs is an economy built entirely on sheep, yet they do not distinguish a single creature from the flock. A chunk of butchered meat reverts to its infancy, and they pull the wool over their eyes before they sleep. In their language, no distinction is made between the farewells of the departing and of those who are left behind. Adventurers, with a questing gleam in their eyes, exchange goodbyes with their abandoned wives. In their language, there are 18 words for rain. I saw my cinnamon ground to powder and used to flavour cakes. I heard them talk of drip, drop, drizzle, hail, sleet, smur, mist and mizzle, a cloudburst, a shower, spitting and spotting, a downpour, a drencher, a deluge, precipitation, and lovely weather for ducks. The origin of this, it's a poem as much as anything about language. It was inspired partly by the understanding that for centuries the Islamic world was the heart of civilization, and Europe was on the edge of the civilized world, and the England was off the coast of Europe. It also plays with the Sapphire Whorf argument about whether language shapes the way we think. And one famous discussion centres around the fact that the Eskimos have so many different words for snow, and therefore they must know more about snow. They must understand snow far better than anybody else. English, as I say, has 18 words for rain. So perhaps we are experts in rain. Also in Tashkent, where they speak one of the Turkic languages, they do indeed have two different words for goodbye, one said by the person leaving and one that is used by the person left behind. And I think that is an interesting distinction, which of course we don't make in English or indeed in most European languages. Finally, I'm going to come full circle and finish with an autobiographical poem. I lost my father when I was a baby. I was 13 months old, so I didn't know him. And this recounts something that happened to me when I was in my early 30s, and I went to an uncle one evening. I spent the evening with an uncle who I hardly knew. I'd hardly ever seen him. Family album. Tonight, this man tapped me on the shoulder and moved on. I was looking at a photograph taken before I was born of grandparents, babies, wives, their children, and my father, here, quite different from the only other picture I've ever seen of him. Yet somehow this image was as known to me as what? Not my hands, nor the hill behind the house where I grew up, nor the smell of imperial leather, all so familiar that I take them for granted. No, this is part of the inside of things, like looking at my own daughter for the first time. Except that this man has been dead for 30 years, and I'm never going to see more of him than I do tonight. I wanted to ask for that photograph, but couldn't. The done thing made me turn the page and look at other people's grandchildren, their holidays, themselves in fancy dress. Besides, what would I have done with it? Kept it till it had lost the power to shock me? Kept it to show my grandchildren, saying, "Yes, that was John, my father." And if they were curious enough to ask, "What manner of man was he?" reply, "Oh, I never really knew him," and smile and turn the page. Okay, that's it, folks. Those are some of my poems from my new collection, Moon's Yard. I hope you enjoyed them. Goodbye, and it'll be back to normal next week.